All right, good afternoon again. Before I talk about integration, I wanted to share with you some data. I think I tried to mention it. In 1975, at the fall of Saigon, we started what we call the modern-day refugee program, because prior to that, we didn't even have a very coherent refugee policy. In fact, we didn't have any department. In fact, the State Department Bureau of Population in terms of refugee was established in March 17 in 1980, if I remember correctly. And ORR was also another organization that didn't exist before, and it was created to provide, to welcome refugees. So I liked, bringing issues based on historical situation. Yeah. So in 1980, when after we passed the Refugee Act, and then the whole structure of how refugees should be integrated or being resettled was designed, but that design continued to be improved and changed. And Sarah mentioned, that we have about 300 resettlement sites around the country. At that time, the number was much, much smaller. So we continue to have some of the agencies didn't actually do refugee resettlement. So I wanted to give you some idea. So this integration discussion I wanted to have with you is based on some numbers. So since 1980, 9 refugee resettlement agencies, one of them actually came up later, resettled through a network, through churches, and synagogue and voluntary agencies, Kwana clubs, you name it, about 3.4 million refugees. Now, there are so many countries, less than 3 million people. And we did this 3.4 million refugees. And one of them is me, and the other one is Eden is also who came in as a refugee. And you will find a lot of people who do that. So one of the best gifts we received, especially if you are coming from a refugee camp, as some of you know that it takes about 17 years an average for a refugee to get a chance to come to the U.S. As you know, the Afghan and the Ukrainian experience is quite different, or the Vietnamese experience, or the Laotian, the Cambodian process was different. It was quick. They came in, we have to find them places, and and the rest is history. So I wanted to present to you the refugee program and integration based on a value system from a very empowering system of refugee resettlement, and the result of that empowering refugee resettlement is and how integration is working. In the U.S. refugee resettlement, there is what I consider as the number one service, or as I mentioned earlier, I believe integration should be discussed, or refugee resettlement should be discussed based on right-based idea, which is every refugee who comes to this country, and there is a law, it's called the 1980 Refugee Act under Section 207. I don't want to bore you. The first thing you get, when I came, I didn't have a passport, but I had I-94. Yeah. So that's I-94 says, authorized for employment. And at the back, there is an agency, a resettlement agency. I see Gerard Brown here, so if I make a mistake, he should correct me because he knows the system. So what happened next is once you arrive in the U.S., it can be like me in Stone Mountain, Georgia, you can actually move the second day to any other state, any other county without any question. Hopefully most of us, what we do is you apply for Social Security, and then you get ID card. And that is the number one thing refugees will notice is they have the right to move to anywhere within the U.S. So if you're living in refugee camp, for 17 years, as I mentioned earlier, there are some refugees still in refugee camps since 1968. There are still refugees in Dadaab and Somalia since 1991, 1997. You live in that environment, and when you apply for a U.S. refugee resettlement program, and when you get admitted, the first thing to get is the freedom to choose. Yeah, the freedom to where to live, the freedom what kind of job you want to have, the freedom to go to school, the freedom to own property, the freedom to start a business. So from that perspective, whether refugees are taking advantage of that right, the rights, the same right enshrined for Americans except voting, as every refugee is entitled for it. So from my perspective, I see things from that perspective, and I see that refugees and immigrants integration started from a federal, state, county, and then from a sponsorship. And then let me give you the integration system at the federal level. So as I mentioned, in 1980, they created the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the Office of Refugee Resettlement provides, when Gerald and I was working at that time in the Vietnamese community, for 3 years there will be financial support. Not only financial support, you can go to ESL classes, so it was funded. You will be also get health care coverage. It used to be 36 months. Of course, now it's a year. In fact, at one time, it was 8 months. So that integration was through the federal government. That money is organized to go to the state system. So in every state, except the state of Wyoming, we had a refugee resettlement office. Aisha is now the director, and Gerald used to be also doing the same. So we have around the country refugee health coordinators. Some of them are appointed by the government, like Massachusetts and other places. Some are very much career state employees. As Aisha mentioned, it's an affinity group. They discuss a lot of things. And then there is also parallel, there is a state refugee health coordinators. And again, all of them around the country except the state of Wyoming. I'm not going to tell you why Wyoming is not having a refugee program. So through that structure, that funding also goes down to the local resettlement agency and non-refugee resettlement agency based on the kind of service they provide. Some of them provide vocational services. Some of them help refugees start a business. There is a micro-enterprise program. So at the federal level, they have so many programs. For education, they have what they call it school impact funding structure. That money comes to the state, and then the state uses it. The amount is not a lot because, as you know, in our system, in our education system, under Title I, anybody can go to school. Yeah. In fact, refugees are eligible, like any other American, for Pell Grant and financial aids if they wanted to go to college. Thanks to your advocacy now, Utah is giving, educational college education for refugees and immigrants and undocumented. So that's the structure we have. And that structure has been since 1980 in some places. So there are some changes. We call it a Wilson Fish program. In some states, the state is not actively engaged, but the number of resettlement agencies are the one who are providing those services. I share with you this structure so I give you a sense how do refugees integrate in this country in terms of employment, in terms of education, in terms of ownership, in terms of becoming finally the most important thing, in terms of becoming a citizen and actively engaged. So that's a federal structure. So let me just show you and some data. I did some research. As I mentioned earlier, I think my colleague is going to be the next presentation. You will see the number of refugee resettlements and the number of refugees who are working and opening businesses around the country. Now, remember that prior to 1980, 1975, other refugees also came in from a different part of the country, and they have succeeded. Some of them became farmers and business people. There are 1980 refugees, and then, since then, the number of refugees who opened business in this country is over $700 billion annual revenue. And I'm using an old data. As I mentioned, the IT, sector, 75%. This is actually, I got it from the White House data. 75% are founding these companies. And I'm sure you know some of them. And then in terms of home ownership, and I shared with you a very small town of Clarkston, Georgia, the number of businesses and the number of home ownership. When you look at across the country, refugees really succeeded because we have a well-organized integration system. Integration system based on the value that every refugee matters. Every refugee is part of the community. Every refugee has something to offer. Sometimes I say to people, we keep saying, this country is a country of refugees and immigrants. If refugees and immigrants are a burden to any society, the US will be the poorest country in the world. Refugees and immigrants are the people who really make this country great. They come, they work, and it's a tradition, It's not that, the Somali refugees or myself from Eritrea and others, it's just a part of the history of this country. This country construction goes through that process like anybody, whether you came from Ireland or you came from Germany. That's a process. That integration, from my perspective, is integration of value, whether you came in from Europe and the Amish came to settle in Pennsylvania and Ohio and other places because they had the freedom. So using that freedom, they decided to be whatever they wanted to be. Yeah. So integration from that right base is very, very, very crucial. The other thing is at the local level, the engagement of faith-based organization, whether it's a mosque, whether it's a synagogue or a church, that connection in the community, because what makes the community is a collection of all that, the people, the religion and business, everything, schools are part of that process. Once refugees have access legally, then, the playing field is clear for refugees to take advantage of it. So from that perspective, if you go around the country, there are new communities or communities was dying, revived by refugees and immigrants. I'll give you a story. I went to Lewiston, Maine, I believe in 2010. Historically, Lewiston is bordering Canada, and most of the people who settled there are mostly Swedish and who came from Canada. In fact, Lewiston, Maine used to have a program to bring in European refugees to the city. After so many years, they used to have a shoe factory, and that factory decided after NAFTA to move to Mexico. So the Somalis, mostly Bantus from Chicago and other places, moved to Lewiston. And remember, we have not resettled them there. There's only one resettlement agency, if I'm not mistaken, in the state of Maine. That's Catholic Charities. And then I went back again, and now the whole downtown is flourishing with business. There's Thai, Indian, Somalis, halal market, and the kids are going to universities. It's unbelievable. But this is a new generation of people coming in to replacing the old generation Americans and becoming a very contributing members of society. Last week I was in a small town, New Jersey. I went there. My cousin's wife died, and then I went to pay respect. And usually in our culture, we go to church and there is service, there is mass. And then the building is very old. So I talked to the priest, how did you get this church? So, well, it used to be a Ukrainian church. We bought it from them. So that city it used to be a Ukrainian, but now the majority of the people there are African American and Eritrean refugees who resettled there. And fully, part of the community, they open garages and businesses. So again, this integration is an idea that has been around for a long time. If you want to talk about integration history, you can go back to 1940. There were studies done by Harvard and Yale trying to figure out in terms of other integration in the country because of a very divided and society we have. As someone once said, every Sunday, people goes to their own sector, and that integration is not necessarily happening through the Sunday services. So if you go to everywhere, you will see that this integration has been part of the continuing history of the U.S. program. I tend to look at life as the glass is half full, but I know there are challenges, especially when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, then you can see there are some other challenges also as part of the integration. As I told you, I believe that we have done incredible work and we should continue to do that, but at the same time, there is some also issues around the country. The resettlement sector itself, if you look at it, our diversity is actually religion, nothing else. Yeah. So in this diversity, in this inclusion environment, policies tends to matter. Yes, we have successful refugees around the country. Some of them are congresswomen, some of them are working in legislation and counties, city, school board around the country, which is wonderful. But we need to think in terms of creating a policy of inclusion. Refugees needs to be at the table to make their own decision in terms of which direction they wanted to go. We need to be partnering with refugees. Sometimes we tend to tell them what they should do rather than ask them what they want to do and how we can help them. So from my perspective, this integration is not a new idea, but we can make it better, and we can actually show evidence of data that it is working, but we need also to take it to a next level in terms of inclusion and diversity, not only just simply hiring exotic looking people, but as a policy, the board of directors for local organization or national organization, all of that matters. Yes, and I think sometimes that refugees, used to tell me, how come so-and-so come and, the other people are not coming in? We have a lot of work to do in terms of our governments and our policy also to be inclusive. Through that integration can happen much faster, more effective. But at the end of the day, I can assure you that from my personal experience, I've been working for refugees, serving refugees for 43 years, that this is a great country. We have the most successful public-private partnership in the world. I have checked other countries, Canada, Britain, Australia. Our model is really unique. It is founded based on our history, but it is very, very effective. But as we go forward, we have to make sure, we make it better. But this is also not the same kind of demographic we have in every state since 1980 or prior to 1980 when the Vietnamese came. We didn't have any community to resettle them. When the African came, no communities. I was there when the Somalis came. in the state of Vermont, I couldn't find a caseworker in the state of Vermont. So I had to get somebody from San Jose, California to move to Vermont. Now Vermont has 5 or 6 Somali businesses now, so including Bantu refugees who came in before the Somali. So we have a very, very successful integration program for refugees, but we need to be inclusive of other migrants, documented or undocumented. We need to see them as the same kind of journey and the same kind of cases they have, even though they are going through the asylum system. Sometimes the system doesn't recognize them as refugees. So I encourage you, as we do this engagement, make sure that we need also to see other refugees. For me, Central Americans are refugees. We're coming because there is well-founded violence against them. May not be the state, but gangs and everything else. So I am a believer. I think what we do is the right thing to do, and we will continue to do it collectively. But it is something I think we, all of us who are engaged in this space, needs to be very proud of. Thank you.
Do we have any questions to our speaker? We're going to open it to Q&A at this point. Any questions?
Gerald, questions? Yes.
So what do we do? How do we prepare for another administration like the previous one? Is there anything that we can do to prepare to blunt the effect of a repeat of that in your mind?
I think I'm going to say something politically incorrect. Yeah, the refugee program, I think the one I know, has been always supported by Republicans and Democrats. In fact, if you look at the data, we managed to bring in more refugees in this country under Republican administration. Now, the Trump year is a different story. So my hope is we don't have to go through that kind of process, and God willing, that if we do, then it is going to be a challenge. Especially when we start also making a national program into a state program where every governor has to make a decision. So that's also another thing that I think we need to work. And I think some of you know, Auntie, you know better than me, in 1989 or something, we managed to bring in close to 207 refugees in 1 year under Bush, the first Bush. Some of the famous refugee supporters, the Kennedys, the McCain, a lot of Republican congressmen, Obey from Wisconsin. It's really, in America, including the both parties have always supported the refugee program. Sometimes the appropriation may be a little bit different, but overall, that this program has been always championed by Democrat and Republican. Part of the challenge we have in terms of refugee resettlement is we tend to bring more refugees post-U.S. government engagement. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Bosnia, Somalia, even very limited time. But I think we are making a good progress in terms of bringing, Rohingyas and Burmese, the Nepalese, the Bhutanese, the Eritreans, the Ethiopians, the Sudanese. These are countries we don't really have any post-military engagement, so our decision is seriously based on humanitarian and sometimes, national security, foreign policy, and humanitarian considerations. So it's a mixed policy. It may drive the different administration, but I am the one who really believe that I think a humanitarian portion is the most important one. I don't mean to undermine the national security interest of the country or the foreign policy, but I tend to think the humanitarian portion of it is important, and hopefully any administration coming in will honor this transition of bringing refugees.
Is there anything we can do now?
Yes. Yeah, I think engagement and advocacy is key. I think this is really the wonderful forum. This is a citizen diplomacy forum. I mean, this is a way to do it. Engage the state leadership, the governors. All of the governors could be very helpful. I think the mayors, the National Mayors Association has been very, very helpful. I think we need to do that also. We can't just simply say, oh, the Biden administration more generous, they bring refugees and private sponsorship. That's fine, yeah. But we need to think, to make this program acceptable for all of the administration, regardless if they're Democrat or Republican. So engagement is number one.